Central Bank of Nigeria gets order to freeze 194 bank accounts. Securities and Exchange Commission say only equities listed in the country are to be invested in. Food prices rise to record highs globally, and as the spring meetings continue in Washington, D.C., Business Express will be looking at how decisions reached will be shaping the economy in Nigeria. My name is Benny Adams, and we are reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. Welcome to the business side of life, and we'll start by telling you that the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, has secured 3 separate interim orders from a federal high court in Abuja, the nation's capital, to freeze 194 bank accounts linked to some business entities and individuals in 17 banks. This was contained in a post on the website of the Apex Bank. The freeze orders followed 3 ex parte applications filed by the Apex Bank seeking a mandatory order of the court to ask the 17 banks to freeze the account of the business organizations and individual pending the outcome of an ongoing investigation the Apex Bank had initiated. Moving on, the Securities and Exchange Commission has warned the investing public on the proliferation of unregistered online investment and trading platforms, facilitating access to trading in securities listed in foreign markets. This was contained in a circular to capital market operators issued by the management of the Commission in Abuja. The Commission categorically stated further that by the provisions of Section 67 to 70 of the Investment and Securities Act 2007 and Rules 414 and 415 of the SEC Rules and Regulations, only foreign securities listed on any exchange registered in Nigeria may be issued, sold or offered for sale or subscription to the Nigerian public. Accordingly, the SEC notified CMOs who work in concert with the referenced online platforms of the Commission's position and advised them to desist henceforth. IMFC agreed to strengthen multilateral cooperation further to ensure a sustainable, inclusive and resilient global economy. This is part of the resolutions reached at the end of the meeting of the IMFC at the ongoing spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF.
The IMFC called on the IMF to make a comprehensive proposal of a new $650 billion allocation of special drawing rights, while enhancing both transparency and accountability in reporting the use of these SDR. It also asked IMF to continue in parallel to explore ways for the voluntary post allocations of SDRs from members who don't.
It would provide substantial liquidity boost to all our members, especially the most vulnerable. We will step up transparency, and it is for the sake of good governance for everybody. And the innovation that we are pursuing is for some of our better off members to be able to allocate their SDRs for the common purpose of bringing the more vulnerable members to a sounder position.
The World Bank and IMF have restated their commitment to the actualization of an inclusive global economic recovery. President of the World Bank, David Malpass, at the meetings said there were multiple focuses that include vaccines, climate, debt and recovery. Let's listen to him before delving into the business of the day.
getting credit. The G20 did, and we were very happy. They welcomed the acceleration of the IDA 20 process, and we're looking to complete it by December, which is important for the world's poorest countries because it's the World Bank's very effective platform to give concessional aid and grants to the poorest countries. There was endorsement of extending the DSSI, that's the debt suspension initiative, through the end of 2021, and quite a bit of conversation, strong support for transparency in terms of the debt contracts. There was also discussion of the common framework. The World Bank and IMF are working closely together to have successful implementation of the G20's common framework to deal with unsustainable debt situations.
Okay, the big issue there at play in the ongoing IMF spring meetings is the global economic recovery, which is strong but uneven as different countries recover at their pace. This calls for support measures to assist emerging economies and low-income countries. Joining me to x-ray the conversations at the meetings is Dr. Abraham Taifa. Doctor, you're welcome to Business Express.
Thank you very much, Benny. Thank you for having me.
Well, Doctor, if you have been following the conversations at the spring meetings talking about the World Bank and the IMF estimates loss in output to cost the world way over $28 trillion by 2025, despite rollout of COVID-19 vaccines and the massive fiscal and monetary policies put in place by various countries. Are these figures disturbing?
Yes, they are disturbing. First of all, the same IMF and World Bank also predicted that due to COVID-19, a new set of 120 million people will be added to global poverty. That's a serious issue. Now, all this discussion is happening in the context of the 2021 spring meetings. And just for our viewers out there, this spring meetings has been holding since 1947. The first one was in London. The first one to ever hold in Africa was in Nairobi, which is 1973. And the current one going on now is from April 5th to April 11th. Sure. So this spring meetings is the brainchild of World Bank Group and IMF Finance Committee. And then when these meetings are going on, you have other meetings also that run concurrently, like G7, G20, G24, and then you have other civil society like
IMFCs.
Exactly, and then the Civil Society Policy Forum. All these meetings run concurrently, so that makes it spring meetings. So basically what they are discussing is economics, governance, and policy reforms. So the concept behind this is that in this current spring meeting, they are pushing out support to help more than 50 countries buy and do vaccination, COVID-19 vaccination, by at least to a very large extent. And then they've also approved helping countries to deal with unsustainable debt, and then they're also looking forward at continuing further effort in helping very poor countries address the issue of poverty. So bringing back to what you asked earlier, you can see that because of all, based on the predictions they give in terms of number of people that have added to poverty and the unstable growth, Nigeria definitely stands a chance to benefit from the overall outcome of the 2021 spring meeting that is ongoing.
Okay, talking about the benefits for Nigeria as the meetings are ongoing, looking at the rollout of vaccination so far for Nigeria, as well as the fiscal and monetary policies being put in place, how would you assess our progress so far?
Well, in terms of progress with vaccination, basically Nigeria has already started in terms of vaccinating its citizens. But basically the extent or the scale or the quantum of people Nigeria would love to vaccinate, I'm sure there's still, we are not there yet. And these issues, I remember what we discussed in one of your programs earlier. No, Nigeria cannot just wake up and decide to buy the vaccine from China or from Norway or from Mexico. It still depends on our trade and our trade stance. Currently, what we have is the Oxford vaccine, and basically a lot of organizations are already making effort to vaccinate its citizens. And what makes vaccination important in this era is that the whole global recovery is hinged or anchored on vaccination. Vaccination simply means higher consumer confidence, higher investors' confidence, higher demand and supply forces, which is basically people, to trade and then bring back, restore goods and services, expand aggregate supply and demand, and the economy starts picking. So the more Nigeria begin to expand, to sustain its effort to vaccinate more people, the more businesses will have confidence to open, hotels open, conferences open, activities open, and businesses take off from there.
Okay, while this knowledge is out there talking about vaccination as key to faster economic recovery, while advanced economies have implemented measures worth about 13% of their GDP. This figure, by contrast, is 4% for the middle income countries and only 2% for low income countries. What are the implications? Do you see this prolonging the pandemic or slowing down the recovery process? 2% for low income countries, 4% for middle income countries, and talking about 13%, that whole lot,
yes,
for the advanced economies. There is this uneven equilibrium.
Yes, basically, don't forget, developing countries or emerging economies, for which Nigeria for now falls within that class in terms of categorization, is still having some issues with receiving the vaccines. The context here is that, okay, it's not just about ordering for 180 million vaccines, but do we have the storage capacity, where the facilities to store the vaccines as per their required temperature across the geopolitical zones? It's not about having it in Lagos or Abuja. Do we have that same thing in Sokoto, where the climate is very hot? Do we have the same thing in Borno or in other places down south in Akwa Ibom and across the nation? So if you build capacity for Lagos to warehouse all those vaccines, or Abuja, how long will it take to transport again? And how does this temperature change as you move the vehicles? So basically, for developing countries, there need to be a lot of efforts to scale up our capacity to receive vaccines, store vaccines, and then disseminate them. But that's another good news from this 2021 IMF and World Bank spring meetings. They are supporting 50 countries globally to be able to buy and do vaccination. So it is one, and don't forget, G7 meeting is also holding in this spring meeting. Yeah. G20, G24. Nigeria belongs to that G24 group. Yeah. And that G24 has 3 groups: African region, Latin America, and then you have Asian group, where UAE and the other ones serve as
organization playing a vital role.
Exactly. Yeah. So Nigeria needs to take advantage of its strategic membership in the G24 group that is participating in these spring meetings, to see how we can benefit from the support they want to give for vaccines, the support they are giving for buying vaccines and doing vaccines. And again, don't forget, anything IMF, World Bank, they made it very clear, even in this 2021 spring meetings, that the support will be for education, health, agriculture, and sector and climate, and sectors like that. So IMF will not be giving support for construction or building. It's for human poverty eradicative programs like that are connected in agriculture, health, and education. So ensuring that we sit up to putting in place reforms that will meet the conditionalities that IMF and World Bank want for countries to benefit from this loan is something that will really be important for Nigeria.
Okay, looking at that, with the efforts being made at making these vaccines available and distributed evenly, there is the issue of rolling out stimulus. Have we done what is needed to be done following the recommendations that we have at the spring meetings? Are we in tandem with what is expected of us as a country?
Well, basically, in terms of stimulus, everything that needs to be done to help, because the whole concept is poverty, eradicate poverty totally, and address inequality in all its dimensions: inequality, horizontal, vertical, any form of inequality, whatever form. So the idea of this stimulus rollout, the federal government as a bulk, as an institution, let me use that word, is doing its best to give out this stimulus. But the database for the agencies that are required to implement the rolling out of stimulus across the 74 local government, across all community states, that database, the National Social Investment Office is still doing its best to raise that number. The last time, they've registered about 26 million. And the Minister for Humanitarian Affairs, that ministry as a whole, is still working to ensure that they raise that number. But if we have registered 26 million people and we have more than 81 people in poverty, you can see that we still have a long way to go. That does not discount the effort of the federal government, but just to show how much we still need to put effort if we want to really make stimulus to have impact in terms of addressing poverty and addressing inequality.
Okay, still on the ongoing spring meetings, there is this international consensus that low-income countries and emerging economies should be assisted, and the IMFC is suggesting IMF to make a general distribution of SDRs worth like $650 billion to members. What is your take on this? Is the amount magnanimous enough?
Well, first of all, we need to check the conditionalities attached to those loans.
To such loans.
Part of the spring meeting is that they've agreed to suspend debt repayment for some time. Now, you are suspending debt repayment. That doesn't mean you won't pay the debt one day. And you are suspending debt repayment or giving debt repayment.
Just a part of the moratorium.
Part of the moratorium toolkit. Don't forget, the market fundamentals will not remain constant for that period of time. Interest rates will still be dancing based on dancing to demand and supply forces. Inflation will still be following demand and supply forces. Exchange rate, investor sentiments, consumer sentiment. So the bottom line is that even though Nigeria will be benefiting from this debt repayments and suspension, we'll be paying that debt one day. So we should be more concerned about the impact of borrowing or unsustainable debt on our development and on human capital development, on poverty, on women and girls, on vulnerable groups. So bottom line, while we are getting that debt repayment holiday, we should be doing our best to take advantage of the domestic economy, to encourage domestic investment to pick up, and above all, to encourage buy Nigerian product idea and to ensure that our domestic economy is right in a manner that encourages local businesses and entrepreneurs.
Okay, still on this grant, talking about this amount that is available, talking about the $650 billion. Yes, there are conditionalities for accessing some of this money. But let's look at the distribution across the board of this money. 38% of this amount is for developed economies. Then we have 3.2% is going to low-income countries. And 3.2% of this $650 billion is like $21 billion. Why are we having more money for the developed economies? Is it about the ability to repay these monies at the right time?
Part of the things to access World Bank, IMF, any form of support, institutional reforms, healthcare policies, agricultural policies. The summary there is that developing countries and emerging countries are yet to get their institutional reform policy right. We must reform in a manner that is consistent with what IMF and World Bank want before we access that credit. Then don't forget, grants and contributions in terms of donor contributions is part of the source of funding our deficit budget. But year in, year out, we hardly get anything from that amount, if at all. We get something, but not really that tangible. So the bottom line is that to attract donor support, you must be able to reform in a manner that is consistent to IMF and World Bank conditionalities. Then remember again, the whole idea of this of International Development Association 2020 support, which is part of what this spring meeting has approved. They are talking about 30-point-something billion that's available, and 26% of that amount is for grants. So for countries to access that money through grant, reforms will certainly be needed. And IMF, World Bank are Bretton Woods institutions. And the kind of reform they'll be wanting will have to do with things like subsidy removal, not influencing our exchange rate in any way, just market-driven deregulation policy, like removing subsidies from crude oil and petroleum price and things like this. So how much we're able to benefit from the outcome of this spring meeting will depend on the bargaining power or negotiating power of our government to see to what extent of the IMF and World Bank conditionalities we are willing to accept, and to what extent of donor and grant support we are also willing to accept based on
talking about managing
reforms.
Debt.
Yes.
The president of the World Bank, David Palmer, mentioned, he talked about debt overhang. With the current borrowing plan of Nigeria as it is today, are we over borrowing, or are we borrowing moderately?
Debt overhang and unsustainable debt is becoming a critical issue in Nigeria. But again, not necessarily because debt in itself is bad. Borrowing is part of the public financial management blocks. Revenue, expenditure, you match them. When revenue is less than expenditure, you still need to spend to achieve development outcome. That deficit must be financed using domestic and external means. The external one is the foreign borrowing. The domestic are other sources for which state governments and also have their own autonomy to borrow. So the bottom line there is that how we are borrowing, we should ensure that borrowing we are, the borrowings we have are connected to the old-time talk about capital projects and projects that have productive multiplier effect. But this time around, we must also be able to ensure that, don't forget, federal government borrows and gives to states also. States don't borrow foreign debt on their own. They must go through the National Assembly and the federal government.
So that means there's a level of regulation.
Exactly. So federal government must also put an eye to ensure that states use their foreign loans for what it's meant for. Otherwise, the burden of debt will erode effort of poverty of poverty reduction if we don't channel it to productive and development activities.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Abraham Teffah.
Thanks so much,
sharing
Benny.
your thoughts on the conversations ongoing at the spring meetings.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Well, moving on, stocks gained for a couple of days at the Nigerian exchange this week, and at the close of trade today, the stocks also advanced, making it the third straight day of gains. The NSE All Share Index appreciated by 0.17%. The All Share Index ended at 38,866.39 basis points. The volume of stocks traded is 160 million, valued at 1.28 billion naira. The deals also, we have 3,507. And market capitalization also advanced to the value of 20.335 trillion naira. And looking at the top trades, we have mutual benefits sitting on the top spot with 22.9 million volume of shares valued at 8.9 million naira. On the second spot is Access Bank with 18.7 million valued at 150.8 million. Then on the third spot is Joe Paul Gold with 14.9 million volume of shares valued at 8.6 million naira. Let's take a look at the global scene, where Asia stocks fall after China posted stronger than expected inflation numbers. Nneka Oko has global market outlook.
Stocks in Asia Pacific were mostly lower on Friday after the S&P 500 on Wall Street cruised to yet another record closing high overnight. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index declined 1.07% to close at 28,698.80. Mainland Chinese stocks also finished lower as the Shanghai Composite shed 0.92%, while in Japan the Nikkei 225 rose 0.2%. European markets were slightly lower in early trading, searching for direction after touching record highs in the previous session. London FTSE slipped 0.31%, Germany DAX dropped 0.08%, whereas CAC 40 of France jumped 0.17%. U.S. stocks idled in early trading Friday after the S&P 500 notched a fresh record in the regular session, climbing 0.42%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average implied an opening gain of about 60 points, while the Nasdaq Composite was the relative outperformer, gaining more than 1%. African markets traded in a negative territory, except for South Africa's JSE Africa Top 40, which rose 0.05% to close at 61,334.74.
Let's now see how the Naira is faring against other currencies. The Food and Agriculture Organization's Food Price Index, which measures monthly changes for a basket of cereals, oil seeds, dairy products, meat and sugar, averaged 118.5 points last month versus a slightly revised 116.1 in February. On that note, let's take a trip to the commodities market. That wraps this edition of Business Express. Remember to keep in touch with us by sending in your comments, observations, and suggestions. Also be informed that all previous episodes are available on YouTube on the NTA's channel. You can also communicate with us on Twitter, and the handle is NTA News Now, and the hashtag is BizEx. Business Express returns Monday at 3 p.m. Be safe out there.